Karl Marx's Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 7, Section 2, The Production of Surplus Value. The product appropriated by the capitalist is a use value, as yarn, for example, or boots. But although boots are in one sense the basis of all social progress, and our capitalist is a decided progressist, yet he does not manufacture boots for their own sake. Use value is, by no means, the thing that one loves for itself in the production of commodities. Use values are only produced by capitalists because, and insofar as, they are the material substratum, the depositories of exchange value. Our capitalist has two objects in view. In the first place, they want to produce a use value that has a value in exchange, that is to say, an article destined to be sold, a commodity. And secondly, they desire to produce a commodity whose value will be greater than the sum of the values of the commodities used in its production, that is, of the means of production and the labor power that they purchased with their good money in the open market. Their aim is to produce not only a use value, but a commodity also. Not only use value, but value. Not only value, but at the same time, surplus value. It must be borne in mind that we are now dealing with the production of commodities, and that up to this point we have only considered one aspect of the process. Just as commodities are at the same time use values and values, so the process of producing them must be a labor process, and at the same time a process of creating value. Footnote, as has been stated in a previous note, the English language has two different expressions for these two different aspects of labor. In the simple labor process, which is the process of producing use values, it is work. In the process of creation of value, it is labor, taking the term in its strictly economic sense. That's a note from Engels. Back to the main text. Let us now examine production as a creation of value. We know that the value of each commodity is determined by the quantity of labor expended on and materialized in it, by the working time necessary under given social conditions for its production. Comment, that's socially necessary labor time. This rule also holds good in the case of the product that accrued to our capitalist, as the result of the labor process carried on for them. Assuming this product to be 10 pounds of yarn, our first step is to calculate the quantity of labor realized in it. For spinning the yarn, raw material is required. Suppose, in this case, 10 pounds of cotton. We have no need at present to investigate the value of this cotton, for the capitalist has, we will assume, bought it at its full value, say of 10 shillings. In this price, the labor required for the production of the cotton is already expressed in terms of the average labor of society. We will further assume that the wear and tear of the spindle, which for our present purpose may represent all other instruments of labor employed, amounts to the value of 2 shillings. If then 24 hours labor, or 2 working days, are required to produce the quantity of gold represented by 12 shillings, we have here to begin with 2 days labor already incorporated in the yarn. We must not let ourselves be misled by the circumstance that the cotton has taken a new shape while the substance of the spindle has to a certain extent been used up. By the general law of value, if the value of 40 pounds of yarn equals the value of 40 pounds of cotton plus the value of a whole spindle, i.e. if the same working time is required to produce the commodities on either side of this equation, then 10 pounds of yarn are an equivalent for 10 pounds of cotton together with 1/4 of a spindle. In the case we're considering, the same working time is materialized in the 10 pounds of yarn on the one hand, and in the 10 pounds of cotton and the fraction of a spindle on the other. Therefore, whether value appears in cotton, in a spindle, or in yarn, makes no difference in the amount of that value. The spindle and cotton, instead of resting quietly side by side, join together in the process, their forms are altered, and they're turned into yarn, but their value is no more affected by this fact than it would be if they had been simply exchanged for their equivalent in yarn. The labor required for the production of the cotton, the raw material of the yarn, is part of the labor necessary to produce the yarn, and is therefore contained in the yarn. The same applies to the labor embodied in the spindle, without whose wear and tear the cotton could not be spun. Hence, in determining the value of the yarn, or the labor time required for its production, all the special processes carried on at various times, and in different places which were necessary, first to produce the cotton and the wasted portion of the spindle, and then with the cotton and spindle to spin the yarn, may together be looked on as different and successive phases of one and the same process. The whole of the labor in the yarn is past labor, and it is a matter of no importance that the operations necessary for the production of its constituent elements were carried on at times which, referred to the present, are more remote than the final operation of spinning. If a definite quantity of labor, say 30 days, is requisite to build a house, the total amount of labor incorporated in it is not altered by the fact that the work of the last day is done 29 days later than that of the first. Therefore, the labor contained in the raw material and the instruments of labor can be treated just as if it were labor expended in an earlier stage of the spinning process, before the labor of actual spinning commenced. The values of the means of production, i.e. the cotton and the spindle, which values are expressed in the price of 12 shillings, are therefore constituent parts of the value of the yarn, or, in other words, of the value of the product. Two conditions must nevertheless be fulfilled. First, the cotton and spindle must concur in the production of a use value. They must in the present case become yarn. Value is independent of the particular use value by which it is born, but it must be embodied in a use value of some kind. Secondly, the time occupied in the labor of production must not exceed the time really necessary under the given social conditions of the case. Therefore, if no more than 1 pound of cotton be requisite to spin 1 pound of yarn, care must be taken that no more than this weight of cotton is consumed in the production of 1 pound of yarn. And similarly with regard to the spindle. Though the capitalists have a hobby and use a gold instead of a steel spindle, yet the only labor that counts for anything in the value of the yarn is that which would be required to produce a steel spindle, because no more is necessary under the given social conditions. So comment, the yarn that is spun with a gold spindle is not worth more, does not have more value in it. Continuing. We now know what portion of the value of the yarn is owing to the cotton and the spindle. It amounts to 12 shillings, or the value of 2 days' work. The next point for our consideration is, what portion of the value of the yarn is added to the cotton by the labor of the spinner. We have now to consider this labor under a very different aspect from that which it had during the labor process. There, we viewed it solely as that particular kind of human activity which changes cotton into yarn. There, the more the labor was suited to the work, the better the yarn, other circumstances remaining the same. The labor of the spinner was then viewed as specifically different from other kinds of productive labor, different on the one hand in its special aim, viz., spinning, different on the other hand in the special character of its operations, in the special nature of its means of production, and in the special use value of its product. For the operation of spinning, cotton and spindles are a necessity, but for making rifled cannon they would be of no use whatever. Here, on the contrary, where we consider the labor of the spinner only so far as it is value-creating, i.e. a source of value, their labor differs in no respect from the labor of the person who bores cannon, or, what here more nearly concerns us, from the labor of the cotton planter and spindle maker incorporated in the means of production. It is solely by reason of this identity that cotton planting, spindle making, and spinning are capable of forming the component parts, differing only quantitatively from each other, of one whole, namely, the value of the yarn. Here we have nothing more to do with the quality, the nature, and the specific character of the labor, but merely with its quantity, and this simply requires to be calculated. We proceed upon the assumption that spinning is simple, unskilled labor, the average labor of a given state of society. Hereafter we shall see that the contrary assumption would make no difference. While the laborer is at work, their labor constantly undergoes a transformation. From being motion, it becomes an object without motion. From being the laborer working, it becomes the thing produced. At the end of 1 hour's spinning, that act is represented by a definite quantity of yarn. In other words, a definite quantity of labor, namely that of 1 hour, has become embodied in the cotton. We say labor, i.e. the expenditure of vital force by the spinner, and not spinning labor, because the special work of spinning counts here only so far as it is the expenditure of labor power in general, and not insofar as it is the specific work of the spinner. In the process we're now considering, it is of extreme importance that no more time be consumed in the work of transforming the cotton into yarn than is necessary under the given social conditions. If under normal, i.e. average social conditions of production, A pounds of cotton ought to be made into B pounds of yarn by 1 hour's labor, then a day's labor does not count as 12 hours labor unless 12A pounds of cotton have been made into 12B pounds of yarn. For in the creation of value, the time that is socially necessary alone counts. Not only the labor, but also the raw material and the product now appear in quite a new light, very different from that in which we viewed them in the labor process pure and simple. The raw material serves now merely as an absorbent of a definite quantity of labor. By this absorption, it is in fact changed into yarn because it is spun, because labor power, in the form of spinning, is added to it. But the product, the yarn, is now nothing more than a measure of the labor absorbed by the cotton. If in 1 hour 1 2/3 pounds of cotton can be spun into 1 2/3 pounds of yarn, then 10 pounds of yarn indicate the absorption of 6 hours labor. Definite quantities of product, these quantities being determined by experience, now represent nothing but definite quantities of labor, definite masses of crystallized labor time. They are nothing more than the materialization of so many hours or so many days of social labor. We are here no more concerned about the facts, that the labor is the specific work of spinning, that its subject is cotton and its product yarn, than we are about the fact that the subject itself is already a product and therefore raw material. If the spinner, instead of spinning, were working in a coal mine, the subject of their labor, the coal, would be supplied by nature. Nevertheless, a definite quantity of extracted coal, a hundredweight for example, would represent a definite quantity of absorbed labor. We assumed, on the occasion of its sale, that the value of a day's labor power is 3 shillings, and that 6 hours' labor is incorporated in that sum, and consequently that this amount of labor is requisite to produce the necessaries of life daily required on an average by the laborer. If now our spinner, by working for 1 hour, can convert 1 2/3 pounds of cotton into 1 2/3 pounds of yarn, it follows that in 6 hours they will convert 10 pounds of cotton into 10 pounds of yarn. Hence, during the spinning process, the cotton absorbs 6 hours labor. The same quantity of labor is also embodied in a piece of gold of the value of 3 shillings. Consequently, by the mere labor of spinning, a value of 3 shillings is added to the cotton. And Marx adds in a footnote that these figures are quite arbitrary. He's not really concerned about how many pounds of cotton go into so many pounds of yarn. It's just for example purposes only, to show the relationship. Back to the main text, let us now consider the total value of the product, the 10 pounds of yarn. 2.5 days' labor has been embodied in it, of which 2 days were contained in the cotton and in the substance of the spindle worn away, and half a day was absorbed during the process of spinning. This 2.5 days' labor is also represented by a piece of gold in the value of 15 shillings. Hence, 15 shillings is an adequate price for the 10 pounds of yarn, or the price of 1 pound is 18 pence. Our capitalist stares in astonishment. The value of the product is exactly equal to the value of the capital advanced. The value so advanced has not expanded, no surplus value has been created, and consequently money has not been converted into capital. The price of the yarn is 15 shillings, and 15 shillings were spent in the open market upon the constituent elements of the product, or what amounts to the same thing, upon the factors of the labor process. 10 shillings were paid for the cotton, 2 shillings for the substance of the spindle worn away, and 3 shillings for the labor power. The swollen value of the yarn is of no avail, for it is merely the sum of the values formerly existing in the cotton, the spindle, and the labor power. Out of such a simple addition of existing values, no surplus value can possibly arise. Footnote here, this is the fundamental proposition on which is based the doctrine of the physiocrats as to the unproductiveness of all labor that is not agriculture. It is irrefutable for the orthodox economist. Quoting Mercier de la Rivière, this method of adding to one particular object the value of a number of others, for example, adding the living costs of the weaver to the flax, of as it were heaping up various values in layers on top of one single value, has the result that this value grows to the same extent. The expression addition gives a very clear picture of the way in which the price of a manufactured product is formed. This price is only the sum of a number of values which have been consumed, and it is arrived at by adding them together. However, addition is not the same as multiplication. Back to the main text. There is in reality nothing very strange in this result. The value of 1 pound of yarn being 18 pence, if our capitalist buys 10 pounds of yarn in the market, they must pay 15 shillings for them. It is clear that whether a person buys their house ready built or gets it built for them, in neither case will the mode of acquisition increase the amount of money laid out on the house. Our capitalist, who is at home in their vulgar economy, exclaims, "Oh, but I advanced my money for the express purpose of making more money." Well, the way to hell is paved with good intentions, and they might just as easily have intended to make money without producing at all. Footnote here, thus from 1844 to 47, the capitalists withdrew part of their capital from productive employment in order to throw it away in railway speculations. And so also during the American Civil War, the capitalists closed their factories and turned the work people into the streets in order to gamble on the Liverpool Cotton Exchange. Back to the main text. The capitalist threatens all sorts of things. They won't be caught napping again. In the future, they will buy the commodities in the market instead of manufacturing them themselves. But if all their brother and sister capitalists were to do the same, where would they find their commodities in the market? And their money they cannot eat. They try persuasion. Consider my abstinence. I might have played ducks and drakes with the 15 shillings, but instead of that, I consumed it productively and made yarn with it. Very well, and by way of reward, they are now in possession of good yarn instead of a bad conscience. And as for playing the part of a miser, it would never do for them to relapse into such bad ways as that. We have seen before to what results such asceticism leads. Besides, where nothing is, the king has lost his rights. Whatever may be the merit of his abstinence, there is nothing wherewith specially to remunerate it, because the value of the product is merely the sum of the values of the commodities that were thrown into the process of production. Let them therefore console themselves with the reflection that virtue is its own reward. But no, they become importunate. They say, "The yarn is of no use to me. I produced it for sale." In that case, let them sell it. Or, still better, let them for the future produce only things for satisfying their personal wants, a remedy that their physician McCullough has already prescribed as infallible against an epidemic of overproduction. They now get obstinate. Can the laborer, they ask, merely with their arms and legs, produce commodities out of nothing? Did I not supply them with the materials by means of which, and in which alone, their labor could be embodied? And as the greater part of society consists of such ne'er-do-wells, have I not rendered society incalculable service by my instruments of production, my cotton and my spindle? And not only society, but the laborer also, whom in addition I have provided with the necessaries of life. And am I to be allowed nothing in return for all this service? I really have to say, this caricature of the capitalist sounds like every libertarian I've ever argued with online. Well, but has not the laborer rendered them the equivalent service of changing their cotton and spindle into yarn? Moreover, there is here no question of service. A service is nothing more than the useful effect of a use value, be it of a commodity or be it of labor. But here we are dealing with exchange value. Footnote here quoting Martin Luther, "Extol thyself, put on finery and adorn thyself, but whoever takes more or better than he gives, that is usury, and is not service, but wrong done to his neighbor, as when one steals and robs. All is not service and benefit to a neighbor that is called service and benefit, for an adulteress and adulterer do one another great service and pleasure. A horseman does an incendiary a great service, by helping him to rob on the highway and pillage land and houses. The papists do ours a great service in that they don't drown, burn, murder all of them, or let them all rot in prison, but let some live, and only drive them out, or take from them what they have. The devil himself does his servants inestimable service. To sum up, the world is full of great, excellent, and daily service and benefit." Back to the main text. The capitalist paid to the laborer a value of 3 shillings, and the laborer gave them back an exact equivalent in the value of 3 shillings, added to them by the cotton. They gave them value for value. Our friend, up to this time so purse-proud, suddenly assumes the modest demeanor of their own workmen, and exclaims, "Have I myself not worked? Have I not performed the labor of superintendence and of overlooking the spinner? And does not this labor too create value?" Their overlooker and their manager try to hide their smiles. Meanwhile, after a hearty laugh, they reassumed their usual mien. Though they chanted to us the whole creed of the economists, in reality, they say, they would not give a brass farthing for it. They leave this and all such like subterfuges and juggling tricks to the professors of political economy, who are paid for it. They themselves are a practical person, and though they do not always consider what they say outside their business, yet in their business they know what they're about. Let us examine the matter more closely. The value of a day's labor power amounts to 3 shillings, because on our assumption half a day's labor is embodied in that quantity of labor power, i.e. because the means of subsistence that are daily required for the production of labor power cost half a day's labor. But the past labor that is embodied in the labor power, and the living labor that it can call into action, the daily cost of maintaining it, and its daily expenditure and work, are 2 totally different things. The former determines the exchange value of the labor power, the latter is its use value. The fact that half a day's labor is necessary to keep the laborer alive during 24 hours does not in any way prevent them from working a whole day. Therefore, the value of labor power and the value which that labor power creates in the labor process are 2 entirely different magnitudes, and this difference of the 2 values was what the capitalist had in view when they were purchasing the labor power. the useful qualities that labor power possesses, and by virtue of which it makes yarn or boots, were to them nothing more than an indispensable condition. For in order to create value, labor must be expended in a useful manner. What really influenced them was the specific use value which this commodity possesses, of being a source not only of value, but of more value than it has itself. This is the special service that the capitalist expects from labor power, and in this transaction they act in accordance with the, quote, eternal laws of the exchange of commodities. The seller of labor power, like the seller of any other commodity, realizes its exchange value and parts with its use value. They cannot take the one without giving the other. The use value of labor power, or in other words, labor, belongs just as little to its seller as the use value of oil after it has been sold belongs to the dealer who has sold it. The owner of the money has paid the value of a day's labor power. Theirs, therefore, is the use of it for a day. A day's labor belongs to them. The circumstance that, on the one hand, the daily sustenance of labor power costs only half a day's labor, while on the other hand, the very same labor power can work during a whole day, that consequently the value which its use during one day creates is double what they pay for that use. This circumstance is, without doubt, a piece of good luck for the buyer, but by no means an injury to the seller. Our capitalists foresaw this state of things, and that was the cause of their laughter. The laborer therefore finds in the workshop the means of production necessary for working not only during 6 but during 12 hours. Just as during the 6 hours process our 10 pounds of cotton absorbed 6 hours labor and became 10 pounds of yarn, so now 20 pounds of cotton will absorb 12 hours labor and be changed into 20 pounds of yarn. Let us now examine the product of this prolonged process. There is now materialized in this 20 pounds of yarn the labor of 5 days, of which 4 days are due to the cotton and the lost steel of the spindle, the remaining day having been absorbed by the cotton during the spinning process. Expressed in gold, the labor of 5 days is 30 shillings. This is therefore the price of the 20 pounds of yarn, giving, as before, 18 pence as the price of a pound. But the sum of the values of the commodities that entered into the process amounts to 27 shillings. The value of the yarn is 30 shillings. Therefore, the value of the product is 1/9 greater than the value advanced for its production. 27 shillings have been transformed into 30 shillings. A surplus value of 3 shillings has been created. The trick has at last succeeded. Money has been converted into capital. Every condition of the problem is satisfied, while the laws that regulate the exchange of commodities have been in no way violated. Equivalent has been exchanged for equivalent, for the capitalist as buyer paid for each commodity, for the cotton, the spindle, and the labor power its full value. They then did what is done by every purchaser of commodities. They consumed their use value. The consumption of the labor power, which was also the process of producing commodities, resulted in 20 pounds of yarn having a value of 30 shillings. The capitalist, formerly a buyer, now returns to market as a seller of commodities. They sell their yarn at 18 pence a pound, which is its exact value. Yet, for all that, they withdraw 3 shillings more from circulation than they originally threw into it. This metamorphosis, this conversion of money into capital, takes place both within the sphere of circulation and also outside it. Within the circulation because conditioned by the purchase of the labor power in the market, outside the circulation because what is done within it is only a stepping stone to the production of surplus value, a process which is entirely confined to the sphere of production. Thus, quoting Voltaire, everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. By turning their money into commodities that serve as the material elements of a new product, and as factors in the labor process, by incorporating living labor with their dead substance, the capitalist at the same time converts value, i.e. past, materialized, and dead labor into capital, into value big with value, a live monster that is fruitful and multiplies. If we now compare the two processes of producing value and of creating surplus value, we see that the latter is nothing but the continuation of the former beyond a definite point. If on the one hand the process be not carried beyond the point, where the value paid by the capitalist for the labor power is replaced by an exact equivalent, it is simply a process of producing value. If on the other hand, it be continued beyond that point, it becomes a process of creating surplus value. If we proceed further and compare the process of producing value with the labor process, pure and simple, we find that the latter consists of the useful labor, the work, that produces use values. Here we contemplate the labor as producing a particular article. We view it under its qualitative aspect alone, with regard to its end and aim. But viewed as a value-creating process, the same labor process presents itself under its quantitative aspect alone. Here it is a question merely of the time occupied by the laborer in doing the work. of the period during which the labor power is usefully expended. Here, the commodities that take part in the process do not count any longer as necessary adjuncts of labor power in the production of a definite, useful object. They count merely as depositories of so much absorbed or materialized labor. That labor, whether previously embodied in the means of production or incorporated in them for the first time during the process by the action of labor power, counts in either case only according to its duration. It amounts to so many hours or days as the case may be. Moreover, only so much of the time spent in the production of any article is counted as, under the given social conditions, is necessary. The consequences of this are various. In the first place, it becomes necessary that the labor should be carried on under normal conditions. If a self-acting mule is the implement in general use for spinning, it would be absurd to supply the spinner with a distaff and spinning wheel. The cotton, too, must not be such rubbish as to cause extra waste in being worked, but must be of suitable quality. Otherwise, the spinner would be found to spend more time in producing a pound of yarn than is socially necessary, in which case the excess of time would create neither value nor money. But whether the material factors of the process are of normal quality or not, depends not upon the laborer, but entirely upon the capitalist. Then again, the labor power itself must be of average efficacy. In the trade in which it's being employed, it must possess the average skill, handiness, and quickness prevalent in that trade, and our capitalists took good care to buy labor power of such normal goodness. This power must be applied with the average amount of exertion and with the usual degree of intensity, and the capitalist is as careful to see that this is done as that their workmen are not idle for a single moment. They have bought the use of the labor power for a definite period, and they insist upon these rights. They have no intention of being robbed. Lastly, and for this purpose, our friend has a penal colony of their own. All wasteful consumption of raw material or instruments of labor is strictly forbidden, because what is so wasted represents labor superfluously expended, labor that does not count in the product or enter into its value. Footnote here, this is one of the circumstances that makes production by slave labor such a costly process. The laborer here is, to use a striking expression of the ancients, distinguishable only as instrumentum vocale, instrument with voice, from an animal as instrumentum semivocale, and from an implement as instrumentum mutum. But he himself takes care to let both beast and implement feel that he is none of them, but is a man. He convinces himself with immense satisfaction that he is a different being, by treating the one unmercifully and damaging the other con amore. Hence the principle, universally applied in this method of production, only to employ the rudest and heaviest implements, and as such are as difficult to damage owing to their sheer clumsiness. In the slave states bordering on the Gulf of Mexico, down to the date of the Civil War, plows constructed on old Chinese models, which turned up the soil like a hog or a mole instead of making furrows, were alone to be found. In his Seaboard Slave States, Olmsted tells us, quote, "I am here shown tools that no man in his senses with us would allow a laborer for whom he was paying wages to be encumbered with, and the excessive weight and clumsiness of which I would judge would make work at least 10% greater than with those ordinarily used with us. And I'm assured that in the careless and clumsy way they must be used by the slaves, anything lighter or less rude could not be furnished them with good economy, and that such tools as we constantly give our laborers, and find profit in giving them, would not last out a day in a Virginia cornfield, much lighter and more free from stones though it be than ours. So too, when I ask why mules are so universally substituted for horses on the farm, the first reason given, and confessedly the most conclusive one, is that horses cannot bear the treatment that they always must get from Negroes. Horses are always soon foundered or crippled by them, while mules will bear cudgeling, or lose a meal or two now and then, and not be materially injured, and they do not take cold or get sick if neglected or overworked. But I do not need to go further than to the window of the room in which I'm writing, to see at almost any time treatment of cattle that would ensure the immediate discharge of the driver by almost any farmer owning them in the North. Back to the main text. We now see that the difference between labor, considered on the one hand as producing utilities, and on the other hand as creating value, a difference which we discovered by our analysis of a commodity, resolves itself into a distinction between two aspects of the process of production. The process of production, considered on the one hand as the unity of the labor process and the process of creating value, is production of commodities. Considered on the other hand as the unity of the labor process and the process of producing surplus value, it is the capitalist process of production, or capitalist production of commodities. So I want to read that again, because that's really important. bearing in mind that commodities are use values, goods or services, which are produced for exchange, and that commodity production can occur in other modes of production than in capitalism. So let's read it. The process of production, considered on the one hand as the unity of the labor process and of the process of creating value, is production of commodities. So let's stop right there. So on the one hand, the unity of the labor process. What's the labor process? Making use values. And united with it, the process of creating value. So this is what comes up when commodities are produced. In other words, when things are produced for exchange. So that's where the value is created. Because remember, we had a note on this after, I think it was chapter 2. Exchange value and value are closely linked. Value is a separate concept, but exchange value is really where value appears in the real world. So, production of commodities, you've got the use value, the labor process, and the process of creating value, which shows up as exchange value. So, the twofold nature of a commodity. Considered on the other hand, the process of production is the unity of the labor process, again making use value, and the process of producing surplus value. In that case, it's the capitalist process of production, or the capitalist production of commodities, because the surplus value or profit-making part of that is really what's key about capitalism. You can produce commodities in a non-capitalist mode of production. Remember the commodity circuit, C to M to C? It's producing something in order to sell it to get money to buy something that you need. Selling in order to buy. And there's nothing inherently capitalistic about that. But then the capital circuit, M to C to M prime, money to commodity to more money, or buying in order to sell, well, that's where the surplus value comes in, the increase in money. So, the process of production, considered on the one hand as the unity of the labor process and the process of creating value, is production of commodities. Considered on the other hand as the unity of the labor process and the process of producing surplus value, it is the capitalist process of production, or capitalist, specifically, production of commodities. Okay. Proceeding. We stated on a previous page that in the creation of surplus value, it does not in the least matter whether the labor appropriated by the capitalist be simple, unskilled labor of average quality or more complicated skilled labor. All labor of a higher or more complicated character than average labor is expenditure of labor power of a more costly kind. Labor power whose production has cost more time and labor, and which therefore has a higher value than unskilled or simple labor power. This power being higher value, its consumption is labor of a higher class, labor that creates in equal times proportionally higher values than unskilled labor does. Whatever difference in skill there may be between the labor of a spinner and that of a jeweler, the portion of their labor by which the jeweler merely replaces the value of their own labor power does not differ in any way in quality from the additional portion by which they create surplus value. In the making of jewelry, just as in spinning, the surplus value results only from a quantitative excess of labor, from a lengthening out of one and the same labor process. In the one case, of the process of making jewels, in the other of the process of making yarn. And a footnote here. The distinction between skilled and unskilled labor rests in one part on pure illusion, or to say the least, on distinctions that have long since ceased to be real, and that survive only by virtue of a traditional convention. In part on the helpless condition of some groups of the working class, a condition that prevents them from exacting equally with the rest the value of their labor power. Accidental circumstances here play so great a part that these two forms of labor sometimes change places, where, for instance, the physique of the working class has deteriorated and is relatively speaking exhausted, which is the case in all countries with a well-developed capitalist production. The lower forms of labor, which demand great expenditure of muscle, are in general considered as skilled, and compared with much more delicate forms of labor. The latter sink down to the level of unskilled labor. Take as an example the labor of a bricklayer, which in England occupies a much higher level than that of a damask weaver. Again, although the labor of a fustian cutter demands great bodily exertion, and is at the same time unhealthy, yet it counts only as unskilled labor. And then we must not forget that the so-called skilled labor does not occupy a large space in the field of national labor. Lang estimates that in England and Wales, the livelihood of 11.3 million people depends on unskilled labor. If from the general population of 18 million people living at the time when he wrote, we deduct 1 million for the genteel population and 1.5 million for paupers, vagrants, criminals, prostitutes, etc., and 4.6 million who compose the middle class, there remain the above-mentioned 11 million. But in his middle class, he includes people that live on the interest of small investments, officials, men of letters, artists, schoolmasters, and the like. And in order to swell the number, he also includes, in these 4.6 million, the better paid portion of the factory operatives. The bricklayers, too, figure amongst them. Quoting James Mill, the great class who have nothing to give for food but ordinary labor are the great bulk of the people. That's the end of the footnote. I just want to make a point here about skilled versus unskilled labor, which is a conversation that comes up a lot today with other definitions and often ends up being very heated, and some people take offense to what's being said about unskilled labor, etc. What Marx means by skilled versus unskilled labor is skilled labor is labor of a higher or more complicated character than average labor. In other words, labor power whose production has cost more time and labor, and which therefore has a higher value than unskilled or simple labor power. It does not mean labor power that is better. It does not mean labor power that does harder jobs. It just means labor power that costs more resources to produce. So, for example, being a dishwasher in a restaurant kitchen is hard work. It also doesn't require special education, so it is unskilled. Again, doesn't mean it isn't difficult, and it doesn't mean that you're not using skills. It means that you can just pick them up on the job, and it doesn't cost any special training or things like that. It is human effort. It requires some amount of intelligence to perform well, but it does not cost more time and labor than average to produce that labor power, which is capable of washing dishes. Now, compare that to something which does require a lot of special training. For example, brain surgery. You cannot wing that with an average level of skill. You have to really know what you're doing. It can't be picked up on the job. And so it costs more time and labor to produce labor power capable of that. It is not just unskilled or simple labor power. So while that phrase has picked up a lot of connotations and people both gloating about being of a higher status or people conversely trying to defend their dignity doing, quote, unskilled labor, we want to clarify that in this sense, we're just talking about labor power that just takes the average amount of time and labor to produce. The work may be backbreaking. It may be exhausting. Very few people may be up to actually doing the work day in and day out. There may actually be a lot of tips and tricks that you need to pick up in order to do the job consistently and on a long-term basis. So a certain amount of expertise that does get built up by somebody doing any job that does not require specialized labor, but just general average labor to do. But at least to just get it done, once, does not require more time and labor than average. Again, looking objectively at labor power as a commodity, we're talking about the cost of its production. And there are indeed certain kinds of labor power which require more than the average cost of production. All right, continuing with the main text. But on the other hand, in every process of creating value, the reduction of skilled labor to average social labor, e.g., 1 day of skilled to 6 days of unskilled labor, is unavoidable. Quoting from Outlines of Political Economy, where reference is made to labor as a measure of value, it necessarily implies labor of one particular kind, the proportion which the other kinds bear to it being easily ascertained, unquote. We therefore save ourselves a superfluous operation and simplify our analysis by the assumption that the labor of the worker employed by the capitalist is unskilled average labor. And that's the end of Chapter 7.